All right, so like I said, last year Mike came to us and gave us a presentation on Professor Hazeltine and his Nuclear amplifier radio circuit, which I thought was fascinating. You know, it's in depth, and here we go again. And you know, Mike has taken on another equally in-depth person, Edward Weston, who happened to be a New Jerseyan. Not by birth, he came from England, but spent most of his time in northern New Jersey, in Newark in particular, dying in Montclair. But you're going to learn tonight a lot about him that you never thought. You thought, oh, it's just these meters here. But for instance, you didn't know that he was an engineer, a chemist, an inventor, and the owner of the Weston Electric Light Company in Newark. But and one of the founding members of the board of NJIT. I can believe that. But if you look at those dates, 1850 to 1938, man was 88 years old. What a life, okay? So, take it away, Mike.
Now, my goal is to give you an appreciation for Edward Weston and his many inventions, not only in meters, and then an appreciation of the meters themselves, but not enough of an appreciation to bid against me on eBay on any of this stuff. So when he first came to the United States, it was after trying to get work in London in one of the universities. He had gotten out of school, trained in chemistry and what little electricity there was at the time, and but came from a middle-class family, so there wasn't really any great opportunities of someone who could get him into working at one of the universities. So on the train he would tell a story about meeting an American who told him about the land of opportunity. So when nothing worked out in London, he against his family's wishes, came with a little bit of money and a lot of aspirations to New York. And they got his first job in electroplating, and that fit in to his talents in chemistry and electricity. And if you think about electricity, this would have been in 1870. Besides electroplating, there was telegraph, or besides that, there was probably electroplating and telegraph, just not a whole lot else. And he was a very good chemist. So he was hired by the American Nickel Plating Company, and actually learned one of the first hard lessons about how American business works. The company's owner was a stock trader and a commodities trader, and he bought up so much nickel that when it came, the prices were inflated. They built a big bubble, and he would not let his own company use any of the nickel for electroplating. So Weston lost his first job, but he became recognized as an expert in it, and he was awarded his first patents for a nickel plating anode and for creating a process for malleable nickel, which is more flexible so it doesn't flake off of things that you're plating. So when he had lost his job, he got an investor to work with him, and he started his own plating business. And unfortunately, he started it right at the what would have been a market crash at the time, the financial panic of 1873. But he did manage to keep the business going, and at that time they started a whole process of the original patent holders were suing all the electroplaters. They had some very broad descriptions in their patents, and what happened is the investor that was with him, Harris, bailed out. He didn't want to be dealing with any of this in court, and left Weston on his own. So eventually, when you had too many fees to pay to get a license to do the plating, the company closed. So he started a second business. When he was working with the plating companies, he found out one of the biggest problems they had was getting a steady current to do the plating. So he started making a dynamo of his own. And eventually he started a company in the Weston Dynamo Electric Machine Company in 1877. And that was when he first moved to Newark to work with a company that he was doing some of the machine shop work for him. And it was listed as being the first company exclusively building dynamos. This is a picture of an early Weston dynamo. He did a lot of work and got a patent on what was called the rational construction of a dynamo. Was one of the first to use laminated pole pieces in his dynamos, and got a big improvement in the efficiency, and was awarded a bronze medal at the Paris exhibition. The top one is a compact plating dynamo, and the bottom one is a dynamo he was making for higher capacity. And what the higher capacity gave him was a chance to experiment with arc lighting. And this would have been in about 1877 or so. You could see in that representation that they didn't even have a globe around it. It was just a big exposed thing. And he gave the first public demonstration in the U.S. was in Newark. And he also became very recognized for the product that they were making. And he started his third business with these lights, the Weston Electric Lighting Company. And it was kind of a smart thing to do because this was going to become a much wider use for the dynamos that he was making too at the same time. So he had automatic regulators to keep the flame steady, automatic cutouts, because all these would be in series. If one went out, then the whole lighting system went out. So that an automatic cutout would take the place of a failed lamp, so the rest of the circuit would go. And he had the most efficient dynamos and the best carbon rods to put in a lamp. He copper plated the ends, he improved the chemicals for a better light, and really made an economical rod. Everybody else was buying them from Europe at the time, and he started making them here. And he did such a good job that his lights were recognized and picked for what would have been the premier project of the day, of putting lights on the brand new Brooklyn Bridge. It was touted as a wonder of the world. And as you'd said, he'd started a central station long before Edison's Pearl Street station. In Newark, they had a service for 300 different commercial arc lights, and they all run from a central dynamo station. The company, as it was making all these different products, put an exhibit together in Philadelphia at the Electrical Exhibition. And in setting up for that, Weston learned how hard it was to prove, they would want to prove the efficiency of his products, and the meters and things that he had to work with at the time were really difficult, and in the back of his head became this message that I'm going to do something better. It took him a full week to prove the efficiency of the dynamos and the amount of current that was being used by his lamps. But since the company was so successful in the arc lighting business, they became a takeover target. And a new company called United States Electric Lighting ended up acquiring a majority of shares and took over the business. So he learned his third lesson in business by not having majority control of the company, and just lost it to other people. But he was hired as a chief electrician, and he used this time to become more of a researcher and started working on incandescent lights. He had a patent for a tamidine filament, hydrocarbon flashing, and a thorium oxide getter. The hydrocarbon flashing was when you had a weak filament, they would put it in a hydrocarbon gas, and as you heated it up, the weak spots would flare up like they're going to burn out the filament, and it would absorb more carbon from the gas and heal itself. So they would send it through this process, and they'd get a much longer lasting filament. And the getter, like you'd see in a vacuum tube, was something he pioneered, where to improve the vacuum they had, he would put that in, they'd flash it in the evacuation process. Some of these he got patents for, others his personality was that he wanted to wait till he had perfected everything, and he would be still working on something he wasn't happy with and find out that someone else had patented it ahead of time. He also did a lot of work to improve the manufacturing process of making the lamps, evacuating the lamps. So he ended up with a lamp that would run for 2,000 hours, and at that point, after years of there being a number of companies selling lamps, the Edison's attorneys started going after the companies. And the United States company was then weakened because they were being challenged by Edison. So Westinghouse bought them at a bargain. And Weston didn't want to work for Westinghouse, so he left the company. And he had spent so much time already testifying in different patent cases that he had built up a reputation and was being hired by attorneys. He was given annual retainers to be an expert witness. So to be an expert witness, he built a laboratory behind his home to set up for demonstrations and models to use in court cases. So it was during this time that he had his own laboratory that he started to take a look at what was needed to basically do electrical measurements and get back to his idea of, I think I can do better. Some of the things that were available at the time were the tangent galvanometer. I've got one up here. Simple device that has a magnetic needle in a compass, and then the current going through the coil develops an opposing magnetic field, and the amount of deflection is proportional to the amount of current. The mirror galvanometer is basically an improved version where the distance, you get a wider scale of movement by the mirror projecting onto the screen in the back. This is a piece I brought here that you can take a look at later. It's an electrodynamometer. What this does, instead of a fixed magnet like the tangent galvanometer, it has two moving coils. So you'd pass a steady current through one coil that's fixed, and then the current you want to measure through the second coil, and it would deflect proportional to its strength against the fixed coil. And the one here was last calibrated in 1893. When Edison's people were getting their lights out on the market, the very first way they could at least measure the efficiency of what they had was by having the whole system running in Menlo Park and see how much coal they used in the furnace to fire the steam, to fire the dynamo, to run the lights. And it was not the way it was going to have to be done. So one of his assistants, Francis Jail, wrote a book called Menlo Park Reminiscences. And he talks about being given the job of trying to figure out how much current and energy is used by the lamps. And they use devices like a calorimeter, where you actually have a light bulb submerged in water. A thermometer would read until you raised it by 1 degree, and then that was the amount of energy that was consumed. And they had an electrodynamometer. I've seen a picture of it that was much bigger than this. It actually had coils that were the size of bicycle wheels. And Edison, they would have to set up so long to take readings, do the calculations. They had to build, sink 10-foot concrete piers into the base of that Menlo Park laboratory to keep a steady enough base for this stuff to work on and not vibrate. That Edison just looked at it one day and said, it's a very scientific looking machine that just doesn't work. And they gave up on it. So that was what was being done then. A little bit later, I didn't get to bring this, it's too darn heavy. This is called a gravity meter. Basically, they would have to stand up on a wall, and there'd be a balance so that the needle would zero out, and then there'd be a coil inside that would move against the current going through. And you can see to measure 80 amps in this one, how thick the coiling had to be. They did pass the full amount of current through the unit itself. So when Weston was ready, he started his fourth company, Weston Electrical Instruments Company. That's certainly the one that stuck. And his goal was to produce an accurate meter, reliable, truly portable, and direct reading. Now, if you look at any of these earlier ones, they're not direct reading. There's not going to be, I put 1 amp in and there's 1 amp on the dial, it moves up to that spot. They're all ones you had to calculate, you had to use standards, you had to use fixed resistances, get it calibrated, and then interpret from that reading that you got to see what you think it should be. They said when they used the dynamometer, you would take dozens of readings and average them out to think of what would be the final result. So And then truly portable, I puzzled about why they kept saying that and then there was one little explanation that it hit home. Any of these meters would have been so expensive that a lab would only want to have one and be able to pass it around to people. If it was a school, each student would get it for, where they've got their experiments set up. So truly portable meant that you could move it around and still have it be a reliable meter. Any of these others, for some of the ones that used the compasses, you had to get an accurate measure of the magnetic field even in a different part of a room before you could rely on the reading that you're getting. So he set those goals. This is the lab that was behind his house in Newark, and a picture of the lab inside. Pretty crude stuff that they were doing at the time. But he was committed to using a fixed magnet and a moving coil. So where the dynamometer had two coils, where the tangent galvanometer has a coil that's then moving the needle, this is a different approach where you have a fixed magnetic field and then you deflect the coil based on the amount of current that's going through it. This was obviously patented by D'Arsonval. You see that name all the time. They're working independently at the time, and some references like that picture from Wikipedia notes it as a D'Arsonval Weston. So his goals to get to that meter that he had targeted was that moving coil with a fixed magnet. He had to improve the permanent magnets that were available. They really weren't that permanent. What you bought was just going to be starting fading from the day you got it. And he wanted to improve the wire that's used in the meter because most conductors, the more current you go through, they heat up. As they heat up, their resistance changes, so you can't get a reliable reading. If you looked at that picture of the General Electric meter with the different scales all the way across, it's because you couldn't, as the coil would heat up, the readings were less accurate. And he improved the spring inside of it, improved the design of the moving coil, and to pass a bigger current through, the idea for a shunt was that you would pass most of the current through the shunt and only a small portion through the coil in the meter. Now, as the company had started, he wasn't at his goals yet, but the one model that's here they did put on the market since they still considered it the best thing that anyone would be able to buy at the time. And if you look, when you get a chance, you can see on either of these that he puts a thermometer in there and a temperature compensation dial, so that you would set the dial to the room temperature, and then he was satisfied that he was getting the accuracy that he needed. And then you'll see later that they took that out of the circuit as they didn't think they needed it. So as this business was starting to take off, they moved to a second factory, William Street in Newark, in 1895. Some of the work that he did to improve the permanent magnet, being a chemist, he worked with creating new alloys. They had a process they developed of aging the magnet, because they would start out high and then level off, heat treatments and narrowing the gap. And to improve the wire, he developed two new alloys that were named Constantan and Manganin, which had almost no change in resistance depending on their temperature. And like I said, the earlier version had the thermometer and the setting on it, and you could see as when it's just a few serial numbers different, there's a plugged up hole where the dial would have been and the thermometer's gone. So the things he did to improve the coils in the meter was kind of neat. He actually at that era was working with aluminum and made an aluminum frame to hold the coil stable, and also it served to basically allow the meter to stabilize faster. And he created this copper alloy for the springs that was non-magnetic, and he used a jeweled movement to support it at the top and bottom. I've got some more on the jeweled movement. That aluminum frame that he used also induced small currents to go through to help steady a meter out. Most of these, as they would reach, the older ones would reach a point and they'd be shaking. You'd have to kind of average out where the actual reading is. But the currents that were developed into the frame stabilized the pointer, so you get your reading right away. Something that you don't even think about now. You just, you assume it's going to go right to where you want to be on a meter. And this is one of the shunts that he developed using those alloys to level out to pass a lot of the high amount of current through the shunt and not through the coil itself, so you could keep the fine coils available. So like I said, he did accomplish his goals, and then they started production. They actually, in Newark, prepared their own wire. He couldn't buy reliably thin wire to make the coils that he needed. They did their own winding of the coils, sometimes by hand, sometimes on machines that they built. So they used 300 different kinds of wire. They made their own magnets and they put them through his treatment processes. And they made their own springs out of this alloy that he developed. And the springs were so sensitive that they'd have to inspect and then sort the springs, and then get them set up to be picked for the right meter for the right amount of current. They did a lot of work with the pivot point that the coil sat on. The point and the jeweled movements were so fine that they calculated out that even though the coil weighs up 1/40th of an ounce, that the pressure per square inch on the point is 1.5 tons. So that's why they had to use these sapphire jeweled movements. And they actually they would make the sapphire craters and then have to match them to a point under microscopes to be selected for each meter. They also, the simple thing like a pointer in there, you wouldn't think is that complicated, but they had a system of balancing them. They'd be put on it for a test, and there'd be a little nut on the back that they would actually back off fractions of a turn to make them work. And they had to print their own dials, sometimes with the aid of machinery, and sometimes just with painting them by hand. So when they worked out all of the things to perfect their shunts, they could actually get to where they were making an 8,000 amp meter for power stations, and only 1/300th of an amp would actually pass through the coil. And one of the other things they pioneered, since Weston was a friend of Dr. Bakeland, he was the first to use Bakelite. When you get to the Model 1 meters that are black, those are usually made out of Bakelite. So all those different parts would go into stock in the factory, and then as a different meter was ordered, they would select the parts on their bill of materials, and the meter would be assembled. And the end result was that he thought was his. Well, they'd have to calibrate it first, I should say, too. It would go against standards in the factory, and they'd make sure that it was going to be what they wanted. And the Model 1, even though he had made other models before, it makes it hard to be a collector because the Model 1 was not the first. It was like 5 years into it. But it met all of his goals of being the first truly portable direct reading meter. And up here you'll see, I think this one is the one that's here. Yeah, that's on the table here. You can look at later. But that would have come out in 1892. And I have some that are calibrated that early.
Sorry, Mike, how much would that have cost at that time?
I looked for catalogs on that and I couldn't find it. So if anyone ever runs into a really early Weston catalog, I couldn't find them on the internet. I couldn't find prints of anything on that. But it was that shunt that let Weston get into the bigger market than laboratory meters, and that was the power station meters. As the country was being electrified, there was a great demand for these meters. And when I've traced some serial numbers on the power station meters, you get them in the 50, 60,000, and when you look at the lab meters, they're in the 4,000 or 5,000. So they were making a lot of these. And they had their own service department, and the meters would come back, and if, like that one with the plug in the spot where the adjustment gauge would have been, they would upgrade it to the latest version and put a new calibration sticker in. This is something that confuses collectors, or if you see them on eBay, they go by the dates that are in the tag on the inside cover and saying, well, that's when it was made. It's got a calibration of 1911 or whatever. But every time it would have been sent in, they'd have peeled off the old tag and put in a new one. So you could have an 1895 meter with a 1920 something tag in it. And all those changes they made, they kept an archive of every meter they ever made in the factory. So the success, just over a few years period, they were in this from 1895 to 1900, and I found a picture of what they had boomed up to by 1906 in Waverly Park. So it's a tremendous change from one building to this giant complex, and these meters are being sent all over the world by then. So, like I said, there's a lot of things about collecting these meters that's complicated. That this next slide, all of these are Model 1 meters, and you ordered it by the specifications that you had. If you wanted a Model 1 that did 10 amps, well, that's the one you ordered. If you wanted one that did milliamps, that's what you ordered, and they were still all Model 1s, even though their own meter up top there was also a Model 1. Until you get used to that, you're going to see a lot of meters out there that say Model 1 on them. And they kept that number, from what I've been able to see, at least for 30 years. And they would only they didn't put out an annual catalog. They put out a catalog if they had enough new products to do that. They might put out a bulletin in the meantime for users, and they could trace it, what they want to buy from that. But they had a wide range. They still made galvanometers, they made watt meters, they made the power station meters, and this is another early one of the Model 1s, which was still one of the most popular. They did stay in meters all the way into the digital age. I have an LED model and a Nixie tube model that the Nixie tube ones are just fun to watch. You just sit and let them rock around. And they made many other products. The Weston was world famous for that Weston standard cell, which produced a steady 1.0183 volts. And in 1911, the International Conference made that the official worldwide standard for voltage. And then they later on pioneered photographic exposure meters. That's what a lot of people know them from. That was such a new thing that they got together with the whole photographic industry and developed things like f-stops versus light and iris settings. Were all done in conjunction with the Weston people. They also made a large number of tube testers. This one is a tube tester that was made for the Navy. So as far as Weston's legacy, he had 344 patents. When he died, he was number 8 on the all-time list of patent holders. He's in the New Jersey Inventors Hall of Fame, honorary doctorates, different medals. As you said, he was a founder of what was then Newark Technical School, became NCE, then became NJIT, and a founding and early president of what became IEEE. as far as the company, they're still in business after 125 years. They're now a part of Esterline Technology and called Weston Aerospace. So the creed that Weston started out with, and that their policy was to serve, help scientists prove new phenomena, help engineers perfect new designs, is really what guided them right from the beginning, and they stayed true to that right till all the Weston family was out of the picture. This has some of his accomplishments. This was taken from a 50th anniversary book that the company published. But he also, just to give you an idea, he had patents in ammeters for automobiles, speedometers, standard cell that we talked about, just a whole bunch of things, right from the first things in electroplating. So I hope that did the job of giving you a little appreciation of all that this man did. As he had said, it lived for 86 years. And was actually active in the company for until he was 80 years old. And then his son took over after that.